Naturally, Amber rebuffed my offer, which I'd expected. I calmly told her, as she loudly argued, that it was either stay with me or stay in the hospital for the next 2 weeks, which would put her at the mercy of the doctors and nurses 24 hours a day for the next 14 days, all at her own expense. The company executives, those above me, decided that because Amber had been there uninvited, essentially trespassing, they would not cover her medical expenses, and in the same breath stated as long as she didn't fight that decision, they wouldn't file criminal charges against her. Amber's health insurance might reimburse her medical bills, but it would take time. She could also have stayed at her hotel, but that would have been nearly as expensive, and all for nothing but for recuperating. Grudgingly, she gave in. "Where am I going to sleep?" Amber asked with suspicion as she walked into my home. "You'll be using the spare bedroom. I had it readied for your use. So go ahead and make yourself at home. I have to head back to the office, but Lucia, the housekeeper, will get you whatever you need. If there are any problems, she can call me at work." Amber looked a bit lost as I left. I'm sure it wasn't the vacation she'd expected, and I certainly hadn't planned on having her stay with me, but we never know how things will work out until they are a done deal. I lost myself in my work, quickly forgetting about Amber and the reason she was here. The day went by quickly. The cleaning crew had been in the following day of Amber's accident and had brought my office back to its original condition. They must have replaced the rug, washed and painted the walls, and whatever else, as there were no signs of what had happened. Certainly, all the blood and its particular iron oxide odor were gone. That evening as I walked home, the idea of Amber staying with me hit me like a barrel of warm shit. What was I doing allowing Amber, an admitted antagonist, to stay with me? It had been a good idea before it became a reality, and now, I wasn't so sure. There wasn't much I could do about it now, but to grin and bear it. It was my own fault and I'd own up to it. "Hello, Mr. Pleasant. Your dinner is in the oven, and I'm going home now. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a pleasant evening," offered Lucia as I walked into my home. Her joke was as old as the Italian hills, from where she originally hailed, and she said it every night, but I didn't mind as she never used it in a derogatory way. I gave her the obligatory smile. "Okay, Lucia, I'll see you tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, did my guest give you any problems?" "Not at all, signore. She was very polite and even tried to help me with my housework. I told her she had to rest so she can get better. Fine, how do you say?" "Oh yes." Finally, she listened to me and stayed in her room. "She is a very nice lady, Mr. Pleasant." "I see. I appreciate your help with this, Lucia. I know it's not part of your job, so I'll make sure there's a bonus for you this week and every week my guest stays here. Good night, Lucia." After Lucia thanked me and left, I checked the oven to see what she made for dinner. Since being in France, rather since I'd hired an Italian as my housekeeper, my weight had become a problem. Lucia made everything from scratch, and the taste of her cooking was something that not even the finest American restaurants could approach. I ate not just to satisfy hunger but to appease my taste buds, and it was beginning to show around my middle. I was delighted by the aroma wafting out of the oven as I pulled open the over door to peer in. It was carne pizziola with pasta, one of my favorites. At least, it was one of my favorites since I'd hired Lucia. I was so engrossed by my gastronomic desire that I didn't hear Amber walk into the kitchen until she spoke. "Hi, Joe." I can't deny I was startled, as I'd momentarily forgotten about Amber. "Hello, Amber," I replied cautiously. "How are you feeling?" I asked as I straightened up, still in some pain, but not as bad as it was. "The pain medication helps." "Good. Are you hungry?" It looks like Lucia made enough for both of us. She nodded her head before she answered. "Yes, I could eat a bite or two. That smells wonderful. What is it?" While I replied to her question, I grabbed place settings for two. I was going for a bottle of wine, but decided that it might be easier on Amber if I drank something else. Although Lucia detested iced tea, she usually made me sun-brewed tea. 2 pitchers sat in the frig. We ate for a few minutes in silence before Amber spoke up. "You've a great housekeeper, and she's also seems like a wonderful person. She cooks like a dream and cleans like she means it," said Amber around a forkful of pasta. "Yes, I was lucky to find Lucia. She came highly recommended. She had other offers, but she took mine. And I'm mighty glad she decided to work for me," I said around my own forkful of pasta. "I can't believe how wonderful this tastes. I've never had anything like it before," exclaimed Amber in savory awe. "Yeah, I know what you mean. Back in the States, we can't get this level of quality food even in the finer restaurants." Although we spoke about the food and the weather and a few other inane things, our level of amicability with each other remained strained and distant, and definitely uncomfortable. I guess years and years of mutual antagonism takes its toll. After eating, I cleaned up and headed to my study to do some work before going to bed. Amber had said she was going to lay down. I find it easy to get involved with work, and in no time, I was deep into it. When it was time for bed, I was asleep before my head hit the pillow. It went on like this for the rest of the first week of Amber's convalescence. We ate, spoke about generalities, and even enjoyed some time together. I was utterly surprised and somewhat disgusted at myself that I could so easily enjoy the company of such a bitch. During the second week, we went sightseeing, although Amber didn't last too long, as too much movement caused her arm to become painful. Still, we both had a good time. We even shared a laugh or two at some of the things we saw and heard. We didn't get to the Eiffel Tower, but its promise was always in the background. Paris is a city for lovers, and as Amber and I spent time together, some of the city's romanticism made itself felt. We never kissed. We hardly touched, but something began to change between us. This change really confused me and caused no little amount of discordance with what I felt for Amber's treatment of me for all the years I was with Sheila. Perhaps her experience with her own morality had changed Amber. I don't know, but the Amber that accompanied me on our outings was not the Amber that I'd known. We had fun. We laughed. We entered into deep discussions. We even argued, but it was only in our differences of opinion about such things like politics. I truly began to look forward to going out with Amber, and I even began to develop amicable feelings toward her. The day finally came when the doctor declared her fit enough to fly. During her time with me, not once had she brought up Sheila. I was grateful for that, but I had expected her to at least try once or twice. So although I was on edge at times, when she made ready to leave back to the States, I was also a bit disappointed that she hadn't mentioned Sheila. It isn't that I wanted to discuss Sheila, only that it gave me a perverse pleasure feeling righteous in those kind of arguments. I wasn't accompanying her to the airport as I had an important meeting to attend at work. Instead, I waited at home to see her off as she awaited a taxi's arrival. Joe, I know I've not been the nicest person to you since we've known each other, but I want you to know I do appreciate you putting up with me these last couple of weeks. I apologize to you, Joe. I figured you for another sort of man. I'm glad to know you are who you are, and nothing as I thought you were. I'll never be able to forgive myself for what I've done to you and Sheila, but if there is anything I can do to make it right, I will. I promise. Surprisingly, I winced at the mention of my wife. I had begun to put aside my memories of Sheila, but now they came back with a vengeance. Along with the anger I felt at her cheating, Amber must have seen my reaction to what she said because her eyes took on a startled look and her mouth formed a small O, which she covered with a small hand. She glanced at her watch, then looked back at me. Joe, please let me say this. I know you don't want to hear it, but I have to tell you. Please let me get it out before I leave. Okay. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I know I didn't want to hear what she had to say, but I also knew that I was either going to hear it now or hear it later, so I figured to get it over with. Taking a deep breath, Amber began her tale. I was the one who saw someone I thought was you, with a blonde-haired woman. At first I couldn't believe it was you, but then I felt vindicated because it supported and proved my previous opinion of you. I didn't tell Sheila right away. I waited until I saw the man with that same woman twice more. I also took photos and video each time, and later I shown them to Sheila. At first, she too couldn't believe what she saw, but the photos and video were damning. Then she became angry. I'd never seen her so angry. What Sheila did to you wasn't something I agreed with, but she was angry and hurt, and afterwards she felt she needed revenge. I stood listening, and something Sheila had said in the video made more sense. I know it wasn't me with the blonde, but the mention of a blonde-headed woman was an odd point of fact. Curiously, I felt an icy calm descend as Amber went on with her story. The last time I saw this man with the blonde woman, I called Sheila and she raced to the hotel I work at to confront you. She stopped to draw a quavery breath. To make a long story shorter, it turned out it wasn't you. That's when Sheila and I realized the horrible mistake I'd made. I felt so bad. For both her and you. I feel responsible for everything, and I know Sheila is feeling even worse. So if you will please speak with her and let her explain, then maybe, I don't know, maybe you guys can find some way to patch things up. I knew there was no way to patch things up. What I'd seen on the video left me unable to feel anything but hate. I wished Sheila hadn't done what she had. I wished she would have come to me. I wished, now, it was too late and there was no option but divorce. I'm not going to talk to her, Amber. There is nothing to say, and you've told me all I want to hear about it. What she did can't be undone. More so, what about the next time she believes I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing and allows her temper to get the best of her? I'm not going to live like that. I don't need to. I could put up with her attitudes and temper for the most part, but not when it leads to her committing infidelities, because she feels she needs revenge. So you can tell Sheila what you want, but I'm through playing with her. I'll be pushing hard for the divorce from here on out. She really needs to get an attorney. It would be in her best interest to do so. Amber nodded sadly and made to get her bags. By the way, who did you mistake me with? I asked out of idle curiosity. She froze, looking like a deer caught in the beam of a car's headlights. In a small voice she said, Hank Pleasant, your cousin. It had been 2 decades since I'd last heard that name, and it wasn't with the best regard that I'd last heard it. Not that there was bad blood between my cousin, Hank, and I, but his attitudes changed after he began medical school. He began to look down his nose at those he considered inferior, which meant most people. He and I look that much alike? I asked Amber disbelievingly. Yes, you do. There are differences, but they're minor ones. The biggest differences are the eye and hair color. Otherwise, you two could be identical twins. I didn't know what to say, not that it changed anything between Sheila and I, but it did cause me some wonderment. Amber, thanks for telling me. Her face lit up and a small smile began, but quickly disappeared as I continued. I wish I could say that it makes a difference, but it doesn't. Bottom line is that Sheila cheated on me and did it with malicious humiliation. I'm not as angry as I used to be, yet she crossed a bridge that no longer exists. Amber looked like she was about to argue, until I continued on. Could you live with a man that cheated to get even with you, whether you cheated yourself or not, and did it in such a way as to rub your nose in his infidelity until you choked on it? She looked at me with a pleading gaze, but in the end dropped her eyes, uttering a single word, no. We heard a car horn blaring, typical of all taxi cab drivers everywhere, and I helped Amber with her bags. In a couple of minutes, she was ready to leave. The driver seemed impatient, so I opened the door for Amber, expecting her to get into the cab. Instead, she turned to me and gave me a hug and kiss on the lips that was far from virtuous. I felt something stir deep within me that had lain dormant since Sheila's cheating. What was more surprising is that it was caused by a woman who I'd not liked very much since I'd known her. Flustered, I stepped away from her, putting the open car door between her and I. She gave a small pout. I guess this is goodbye, Joe. Thanks again. For everything. She looked like she was going to say more, but turned abruptly and entered the cab, closing the door behind her. The driver tore out. I looked on and Amber never turned her head to look back. For some reason I felt disappointment at that. Amber had returned with her news, and it wasn't good at all. Meanwhile, Sheila was still sulking. I was beside myself with the thought that Joe was going to divorce me. I know it all was my fault. I know that, but I felt resentment building towards him because of his refusal to speak with me. Amber tried to cheer me up, but I was too deep into self-pity that she finally quit trying. Why wouldn't Joe give me a chance? I know I was wrong with what I did, but it was a mistake. I didn't do it because I needed another man in my life. Amber even tried to tell me that what I wanted was the very same thing I denied Joe, before I went and screwed another man and rubbed it into my husband's face. I should have talked to Joe, asked him why he was cheating on me. I know that now, but couldn't Joe tell how much I loved him? How much I needed him? How much I missed his gentle, loving ways? I think I angered Amber a few times, which surprised me, as it seemed she was defending Joe. My friend, the one who despised him for so long, was actually standing up for him. We were at one of our weekly luncheons at a cafe near her work. Come off it, Sheila. How do you expect any man, especially a proud man like Joe, to forget what you did when you sent him an in-your-face front stage seat to your screwing around? I know why you did it, but I told you before you went through with it that you should be ready to handle the consequences. I know, but I didn't expect it to turn out as it did. I really thought Joe was cheating on me, and at the time, my thinking was blurred by my anger at him. I was so mad. But why can't he at least sit down with me and talk it out? We have too much invested in our marriage to simply throw it away, like something still useful but old and obsolete. Amber sighed as she looked at me with pity. Pity? I didn't need her pity. All I wanted was my Joe returned to me. Sheila. I tried everything I could to convince him. He didn't leave much wiggle room, and he only listened because I begged him to. I'm sorry, and I feel bad that I'm the cause of your marital problems. But if you are being totally honest, then ask yourself why you didn't give Joe the same consideration you are now asking from him. Is his reaction to the video you sent any different than how you reacted? You were all set to divorce him, remember? At least he hasn't sent you the same response you did to him. I stared at my friend Amber, wondering why she was defending the man she had hated so vehemently not so long ago. Amber, why are you on Joe's side? Did he you? I began. God, Sheila, no. I didn't do anything with Joe, and he never tried anything either. The only thing that happened is that I realized how wrong I was about him. I know it's too little and too late, but Joe is what he seemed all those years. A loving, caring, strongly devoted husband. I don't think he ever entertained the tiniest thought of cheating on you. I saw the man up close when I mentioned your name and explained what happened. He is still filled with a deep hurt. And yes, he's still angry about everything. But never once did he insinuate, hint, or even joke about anything inappropriate. I'm sorry, Amber. I guess I'm getting paranoid about the entire thing. I know, hon, but this is me. I'd never jump on your boat and start paddling it. Anyway, as I said, I'm at the very least partially to blame for this mess. And I'm not going to mess it up any worse than it is. Not anymore. Amber said with solemn finality. Our conversation switched to other topics after that, but I began to suspect that Amber, my best friend, might be having feelings for my husband. It was just a wild guess. And this time I wasn't about to lose my cool and do something I'd regret. Instead, I would be extra watchful. Amber is my best friend, and until I screwed up, we were on the same wavelength. I know how I felt when I thought Joe was cheating on me. It drove me nuts. I was mad with the pain of a broken heart, and my mind was all about getting paid back. So I could imagine what Joe was feeling. Only, I took it a few steps above the norm. I wanted Joe to feel more than pain. I wanted him to feel the utter helpless humiliation of being cucked, and to watch it happen before his very eyes. Now, I have more than the memory of my cheating seared into me. I have 10 times the humiliation I tried to inflict on Joe. When I discovered how wrong I was, I had to go undo the hurtful things I told family and friends about Joe and tell them about my own deed. When I'd first told them about what I thought Joe had done, they'd all been very supportive of me, and I felt vindicated in my feelings. If I had stopped there, after I found out the simple truth of Joe never having cheated, then my family and friends would have had a good laugh, probably at my expense, and Joe and I could have patched things up. I would have bent over backwards to make up for my distrust of him and my accusations. But when I went back to explain to the same people what had truly transpired and of my own infidelity, the warm, loving support that had previously been extended was suddenly gone, and I was persona non grata. After that, the only person I had that continued to stand by me was Amber. Yet, I held a suspicion that even my best friend was beginning to bail on me. After our last luncheon, all of a sudden, Amber was too busy to meet with me. Also, she was never home, or she was too tired to get together after work. We were supposed to be best friends. One day after work, for months since our last get-together, I waited outside in the hotel's employee parking area of where she worked until she came out. I could see several emotions play across her face when she saw me. Upon seeing her reaction, I grew angry. Why would my best friend not want to see me? My guess was Amber had lied, and now she and Joe were an item. Guilt does strange things to people, and I was sure that Amber's attitude towards me was because of Joe. Hello, Amber. Remember me? Your best friend? I remarked sarcastically. Amber had always been somewhat of a moody person, but just then I saw something that she'd never directed at me. Disgust. Hi, Sheila. How have you been? Amber asked, ignoring my sarcasm. I've been better. What's up, girlfriend? Why have you been avoiding me? As I've told you, I've been busy, replied Amber tersely. So busy that you can't talk to your best friend anymore? No, I mean, began Amber, then looked me in the eye with a harshness I'd never been the target of. You're right. I'm not that busy. The truth is, Sheila, I'm tired of walking the same old path with you every time we get together. It's always how much you love Joe. Or why doesn't he talk to you? Or, the thing is, I'm tired of hearing it. We both know the why of it all. I screwed up. You screwed up. It's done and over with. Joe is not going to give you the time of day. He's moved on, Sheila, and... She stopped and studied me a moment, while I stood reverberating from the unexpected assault from my friend. Her expression changed to a warm, kindly one, then draped her arm across my shoulders. Sheila, it's time for you to move on too. She said it so softly I almost didn't hear her. I didn't expect this from a person I'd known most of my life. What was she saying? Why was she telling me this? What's going on, Amber? Are you and Joe? I couldn't finish what I'd started to ask. The pain hit me afresh. She looked at me in anger mixed with pity and something else, but I didn't recognize the other thing. No, Sheila. No, there is nothing between me and Joe. But, don't you see? I try to talk to you, and immediately you're suspicious of me. Why would I want to be around that sort of treatment? Sheila, you're my best friend and I love you. but you need to let this go. Joe is not coming back to you. It took me a moment before I heard her words and felt them sink in. Why, you bitch? You're after Joe yourself, aren't you? You're just waiting for me to give up so you can move in for the kill. Well, let me tell you something, you bitch. I'm never going to give up Joe. I know he'll. With a deep sigh, Amber stepped back, turned, and walked to her car. Come back to me. Don't you walk away from me, you cheating bitch. I know what you're up to, and I'm not going to sit back and let you get my Joe. You tramp. I was still raging at Amber as she pulled out of the parking lot and sped down the street. Meanwhile, Joe was still in France. I'd lost track of time. I know another Christmas had come and gone, and I had a vague memory of bringing in the new year, but work was my main focus. The Paris office was now the company's premier showcase. Where we'd once been no more than a lowly dollar amount on some accountant's spreadsheet, we were now fast approaching the point of being a global nexus for all the company's clients and prospects. Even the Chinese and Arabs were sniffing at our doors. Although I still didn't mix too deeply with the office personnel, I was far more comfortable with them as they were with me than I'd been when I first took over. In fact, if I recall correctly, on New Year's Eve I was made an honorary Frenchman by unanimous vote of the entire office. I'm still unsure how to feel about that, but a pall had settled over me as we entered the new year. My company had informed me that my time in Paris was soon coming to an end, and I was slated to go back to the States for another promotion, meaning a raise and a new position. That was another thing I was torn about. In France, I was able to put aside what I'd felt about Sheila's actions, and in doing so, my work had excelled beyond my wildest dreams. I knew Sheila didn't have the financial resources to fly and stay in Paris just to talk to me. And yes, she had called, emailed, and even used smoke signals to get in touch with me. Okay, she didn't use smoke signals, but I think she would have tried if she'd thought they would have worked. My returning to the United States had me confronting the issue of my divorce from Sheila. It was all but history, and since Sheila had dropped her petition for divorce, it had been left up to me to do something about it. It had been a rough time. Sheila fought the divorce, managing to somehow delay it more than once. It was yet unresolved. She used the same attorney as before, Wanda Kimmer, only now her tactics were to buy time. My attorney said the judge was considering one of Kimmer's ruses, ordering us to couples counseling. As I was in France and unable to travel due to critical conferences I had to attend, the divorce would be put off until I was back in the States. I was yet smarting from what Sheila had done to me, but I was far past the first stages of it. I no longer wanted to kill her. I just wanted her to drop dead on her own. I guess I'd made some progress. Then the day arrived, and I was boarding the plane that would begin my journey home. I was surprised and touched by how truly saddened my office staff became when I left for the last time. There was a going-away party, and several of my people said some very nice things about me that I never thought I deserved. They were a good bunch, and I was going to miss them. Now, I wish I had gotten to know them better, but then again, if I had, would we have become the dynamo the office is today? I don't know, yet. I regret I didn't choose to find out. I don't recall much of the trip back as I was lost deep in thought when I wasn't sleeping, and worst of all, I couldn't recall what I'd thought about. When we landed at JFK International, I was greeted by one of the company's drivers along with a very nice limo. I was slightly taken aback by the royal treatment, but I wasn't complaining, so I was in somewhat of a receptive mood when the driver dropped me off at one of the better hotels in the city. The driver helped me get my bags and take them into the hotel's lobby, where he deposited them on a cart, saying he would return the following day to take me to the main corporate office. Remember, I didn't have a home to go to anymore, so until I found a place of my own, I was stuck living in a hotel. As nice as the hotel was, I would need to look into getting a place of my own as soon as I could. After checking in, I was about to head up to my room when I recognized a face. It was Amber. She'd already seen me, but hadn't approached. She was standing near a door behind the front desk and looked even better than last time I'd seen her, which was the year before when she'd come to talk to me. Yes, I was over most of my anger toward just about everyone. Life is too damn short to waste it on hating. Truthfully, I didn't hate Sheila anymore either. I just wanted her out of my life. Amber waved at me a little uncertainly. I waved back in an obviously more amicable manner. She smiled, and I thought that she was even more beautiful than I remembered her. I caught myself before I could go further with that train of thought. After all, Amber was Sheila's friend, and everything I said and did was sure to get back to Sheila. Not that I cared, but why stir up the killer bees worse than they already were? Plus, Amber might still believe me to be an adversary, although I had to laugh at that thought. With a final wave, Amber passed through a door on the far side of the front desk. I figured she didn't want to talk to me. I didn't see Amber the rest of the day, and when I left for the office in the morning, she wasn't around. And to be honest, I was feeling some disappointment about that. I don't know why, but ever since Amber had stayed with me, I've been feeling more ambivalent toward her. Talk about an internal conflict. I was greeted with great fanfare by the corporate bosses and treated to an expensive lunch before we got down to business. They offered me a great package along with an even better position. I was to be the new vice president of marketing and sales, second only to the main man himself, Roland Emerald. The salary offered was 7 figures with a generous piece of the pie in the form of stock options. There were other things, but those two were the main selling points. I also got the distinct impression that my bosses were trying very hard to keep me. While in Paris, I had had a few offers from other companies, mostly European, and their employment packages were just as attractive as the one I was being offered. Perhaps my company had heard about those propositions. I suspected they had. They asked, nicely, if I would take the position. Of course, I agreed. But not without hemming and hawing a little, which I noticed had them sweating a bit. We also came to terms on some concessions, and they agreed to the few stipulations I had. Thus, I was in a great mood when I finally made it back to the hotel that evening. I saw her immediately. She hadn't seen me yet, but unless I moved my big feet faster, she was bound to turn my way soon. And she did. Her smile lit up her face as bright as the sun on a new spring day. And where yesterday I thought how beautiful she was, today my breath caught in my throat at her lovely radiance. I saw her approach me. I saw her look at me, and I saw how she looked at me. If I didn't know better, she was looking at me like a cat eyes a mouse. Hello, Amber. How have you been? I managed to say without tripping all over my tongue. Pretty good, Joe. You look great. Seems like you've shed a few pounds, in spite of Lucia's wonderful cooking, she teased. Thanks. Say, I didn't know you were working at this hotel. I thought you were over at. I started to say, but stopped at Amber's sudden change in expression. Her smile had waned and turned into a thin line of displeasure. Yeah, well, times change and I thought a new job would be beneficial. Amber explained flatly. Really? What do you do here? I asked, curious as to her mood swing. I'm the assistant general manager. It means a larger salary and better benefits. Wow, that's great. I said with real enthusiasm. I don't know why I cared about Amber's life. Maybe her time staying at my place in Paris had changed me more than I suspected. Changed both of us, it would seem. Thank you. So, Joe, how have you been? She asked with some trepidation. I looked at her, and something inside me turned off, and something else turned on. When do you get off today? She gave me a startled look, then thought for a second. Answering hesitatingly, she said, I'm off now. I was just leaving when I saw you. Why do you ask? I want to take you out. I want to share something with you. She had a troubled look on her face. I don't know if that's a good idea, Joe. I mean, I would like to go out with you. But I knew she was referring to Sheila without mentioning her name. It's okay. It's just a friendly dinner and some pleasant talk. Like what we did back in Paris when we shared Lucia's cooking. I said with a grin. She smiled again, and once more I was swept away. Okay, Buster. You have a deal. Only I don't think we'll find anything to match the food we ate back then, she said mischievously. I laughed. Then we'll just have to make the most of it with what we can get. I wanted to shower and change, but decided that it was already getting late, and I didn't want to stay out all night. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision asking Amber out, but it felt right. We were going to grab a cab, but Amber wanted to walk to the restaurant. It was but a few minutes' walk, and we exchanged social pleasantries on the way. The food was good, but nowhere near the flavorful quality of Lucia's. As we ate, I idly wondered if Lucia would be willing to relocate to America. We made small talk as we ate, me catching up on things since I'd been gone, and her wanting to know about parts of Paris she hadn't seen. After we had shared a bottle of wine and had eaten our fill, I sat back and looked at Amber. She fidgeted after a few seconds and asked, What? Do I have something stuck in my teeth? I chuckled, saying, No, you look fine. I was just, want to go dancing? Amber stared at me in surprise. I don't know about that, Joe. You're still married to Sheila. That's more than sharing a meal. I don't think it's a good idea right now. Okay, dumb idea. My bad. I replied, my mood quickly changing to a more severe one. Amber fidgeted in her seat again, saying, No, it's not a bad idea. I would love to go dancing with you. I really would. I just think the timing is bad. I sat quietly as I listened to Amber talk. When I was sure she was finished speaking, I spoke up. Sheila and I are done. Amber, Feeny, kaput, over with. She's been fighting the divorce with, what I must admit are, novel tactics. But nothing is going to change what I no longer feel for Sheila. All she's doing is putting up roadblocks, and that's just making me more stubborn about things. I've offered a very generous settlement regardless of what she did to me. Truth is, I just want all this to be over with so I can move on. I know she's your friend, Amber. I know you'll stand by her, and I can't say I blame you. She's your friend. But it's over between her and I. It has been since that night she sent me the video. Amber had lowered her head as I spoke, until I couldn't see her face. I know, Joe. I know. But I can't, she said in a quavery voice. What can't you do? Spend time with me? Or is there something else you're not saying, Amber? She looked up at me and tears had filled her eyes. Sheila and I aren't as friendly anymore, Joe. I don't know. She's not the same person I knew before all this. She's changed, becoming focused on one thing only, and that's getting you back, whatever it takes. Because of that, I don't see her anymore. I was surprised to hear this, and the fact that it was Amber telling me, well, I should have been filled with malicious glee at the news, but surprisingly all I felt was sorrow for both women. I'm sorry to hear that, Amber. I really am, but that has little to do with me, or with you and me. There, I'd said it. What would she do now? What would she say? Her look was priceless, and if I'd had a camera, I'd have snapped a photo, so I could view her expression over and over. What do you mean, you and me? I mean, you and me. I'd like to get to know you better, Amber. I like the time we shared in Paris. Now, tonight, I find myself enjoying your company even more. I think Amber's expression can best be described as aghast. What? What did you say? Did you just say you wanted to get to know me better? How? I mean, in what way? I had to laugh at her reaction, but I also reached out and held her hand. In the same way as any man is interested in getting to know a beautiful, intelligent, and charming woman. She was stunned by my reply. Clearly, I had caught her off guard, and it wasn't that I was playing a game with her. If so, I was playing one with myself as well. I was as caught up in the situation in a way that made me feel I had no control. Instead of fighting it, I was going with the flow, interested in where it would take me and maybe Amber. I had no idea, Joe. This is so sudden. And really, why are you telling me this? Is it to get back at me and Sheila? Is that it? Were you going to use me against Sheila? Amber was getting angry, mistakenly so. Rather than answer Amber's accusation, I waved our server over and asked for the bill. He laid a rather large leather-bound folder on the table. I handed him my credit card, and he whisked the folder and my card away. Well, are you going to answer my question? Or hide behind your silence? Demanded Amber angrily. What I'm going to do is pay the bill and walk you out, where I'll hail a cab for you, and then I'm going to get another cab and head to the hotel. I stated calmly. That doesn't answer my question, Joe. Were you planning on using me to get back at Sheila? Amber asked once more. I stared at Amber, my emotions shuffling between anger and what? I didn't know. I thought Amber would be feeling what I felt, but apparently she wasn't. All she had in her was the same old anger with the same old presumptions. She hadn't changed as much as she thought, but I had, and I wasn't about to step back into the old way of things. It was best I end it here and move on. I had in mind to share the news about my new position with Amber. I had felt the need to share it with someone, and it seemed that she would be the perfect person. I'm not going to bother answering your question, Amber. She started to say something, but I cut her off before she could utter a word. It wouldn't matter what I said. You believe what you wanted. So it really doesn't matter. She looked at me, staring into my eyes, then searching my face. I sat there, quietly and unflinching, as she finished looking for whatever. I'm sorry, Joe, it's just that, began Amber, when the server appeared with the receipt for my signature. I added a decent tip and handed it back to the server, who then left quicker than he had shown up. Amber had cast her gaze down to her hands as I took care of the bill. When the server departed, I made to stand. She raised her head and said in a heavily strained voice, Sheila has been accusing me of having something going on with you. I've told her I didn't, but she doesn't believe me. The last time I spoke to her, she had shown up at my old job, waiting for me in the parking lot. We had it out, and when I drove off, she was still standing there continuing to cuss me out. After that, I changed jobs and came to work for the hotel you're staying at. That was several months ago. I don't think Sheila knows where I work. Also, I've been looking for another apartment. I fear Sheila has lost her mind. At least, where it involves you. I had stopped moving as soon as Amber began talking, and when she finished, I finished standing. Amber stood up as well, but didn't step away from the table. I'm sorry, I asked you that question, Joe. It wasn't fair. I guess with everything going on with Sheila and me, I've sort of become paranoid. Will you please forgive me? Asked Amber in a small voice. I slowly nodded. Okay, Amber, you're forgiving. So forget it. I enjoyed this evening with you. But since you being with me is a problem, then this will be our last time together. Amber seemed to deflate before me as she nodded her head in understanding. Do you still want to go dancing? I looked at her in speculative wonder. I don't know. Wouldn't that be in conflict with what you said about my still being married? I know what I said, Joe, but I find I don't care. I've also enjoyed our time tonight and I messed it up. When we part, I want the last thing on our minds to be pleasant and fun. So are you game? She asked in her patented sultry voice. Sure, why not? I replied. I still wasn't over her little outburst, but what the hell? She had a point. If this was to be our last time together, why not finish it with some good memories? I knew of a club near the restaurant where they had dancing. It was drizzling lightly, more a mist, as we exited the restaurant. Without thinking about it, I removed my jacket and placed it over Amber's head and shoulders. She began to protest, but my mock stern look quelled her complaints. She then smiled at me. Thank you, Joe. You really are something else. We strolled to the street corner, where we had to wait for the walk signal, when I looked down at her. Again, I was taken by her beauty and her, for want of a better term, sheer sexual essence. I felt my heart beating a different tempo and my gut tightening up. I even felt a slow stirring in my groin. She still wore the smile, with a happy and serene expression. Amber? Yes, Joe, she replied as she turned to look at me. Without conscious thought, I felt my arms reach out, my hands move up and grab her by the shoulders, pulling her to me, at which point I lowered my mouth to hers. My lips touched hers as a butterfly lands on a leaf, soft and easy. It was the caress of a lover's touch. She tried to pull back, but I held her in place, and then she began to respond. Our kiss turned into a passion-filled lip lock that shifted my being into another dimension, where everything seemed clean, bright, and full of promise. Her arms lifted up to encircle my shoulders and neck, while mine went low and high. I pulled our bodies ever tighter as our kiss deepened. My hand roamed the small of her back, while the other caressed her shoulders and neck. Her hands were moving back and forth between my head, my neck, and my shoulders as she too tried to pull closer. I don't know how long we stood there in the rain, but it wasn't long enough. Our kiss finally ended when she pulled back and pushed me away from her. Her hair was beginning to stick to her face as the drizzle had turned to solid rain and began soaking it. During our kiss, my coat had slipped off her and fallen to the sidewalk. It seemed unimportant. It was a nothing, compared to what I felt and was sure she felt. It was everything good the world had to offer and more. What was a little rain in that context? Amber, I think I love... I began, before she looked up at me with searching eyes, interrupting me. Joe, what are you saying? Then the realization hit her. Oh, Joe, I can't. I just can't. I'm so sorry. I stood there, still holding her, while her hands pushed on my rapidly soaking shirt. I was trying to come back down from my high, trying to listen to her words. What? I'm sorry, Joe, but I can't do this. I'm sorry. With those words, she forcefully tore out of my grasp and ran blindly into the street. She was nearly across the roadway, as I stood in dumb disbelief, feeling confused and emptied by her words, when she was hit by a car. There wasn't much traffic, but it was enough. I heard her terrified scream and then the dull sound of the impact of metal on flesh. A horrible sound of a loud, meaty thump. I saw her swiftly flung into the air, landing hard on the asphalt, and then rolling in a tumble of arms and legs. She came to a stop near the curb, laying there in a twisted heap, almost unrecognizable as the woman who just a moment ago was safe in my arms. The vehicle that had mowed Amber down swerved a couple of times, its tires explosively splashing the puddles of water on the street, finally regaining control before rapidly speeding away. I saw Amber's unmoving form grow in my vision. I must have started toward her, but I couldn't feel my body moving. I wasn't in shock. I wasn't stunned. It was beyond any of that. As I couldn't feel my limbs, I couldn't feel any emotion either. There was no feeling of horror, no terrifying expectation. I was simply existing. Amber was broken. Her arms and legs were bent at odd and discordant angles. Her body was twisted and things of a pearly white color, covered with smears of blood, protruded out of her skin. I heard other people rushing up, screaming and yelling, in the grip of whatever emotion they felt at seeing Amber's bloody broken body. My sight picture had Amber's face filling it, and I suppose I must have knelt next to her. I saw bloody froth bubbling out of her nose while a thick trickle of blood slowly ran out of her mouth. The increasing downpour of rain washing the blood away almost as quickly as it poured out of Amber. I heard someone loudly calling her name and idly wondered who it might be that knew her name. I wish they would shut up because I needed to concentrate on Amber, to help her, and the incessant calling of her name was both annoying and distracting. I saw her eyes flutter open. She looked around and saw me, but her eyes were not truly focused. They saw something beyond me, and I was too intent on trying to help her to look at whatever she was looking at. She smiled. Her mouth was a bloody, swollen maw, yet she was beautiful as ever. "Joe," she whispered, her eyes refocusing on me. I smiled back at her. "I'm here, baby. Everything is going to be okay. Just relax." "Joe, She looked back at whatever she'd seen before. "Shoo, you're going to be fine," I said, believing my own words. "I love you, Joe. Always have. I'm sore," she said in a gasp of a whisper. "I love you, Amber," I replied joyously, but her eyes had closed and her breathing had stopped. "No, Amber, you're going to be okay. You hear me, Amber?" Someone tried to pull me away, but I shook them off. "Sir, we can't aid her unless we can get to her. You're in our way, so move away, sir. I promise we'll do all we can." I let them move me away. I heard and saw several people around me. I also saw the red flashes of an emergency vehicle, the ambulance, I guessed. I finally came to my senses sitting on the sidewalk with my back against the wall of a building near the corner where Amber had been killed. A couple of police cars were still there, parked along the curb, one to each side of the street. I vaguely remember the police speaking with me and asking questions. I don't know what I told them. I must have said the right things because I wasn't cuffed. What Sheila had done to me had cut my heart out and left me filled with a maddening anger, helpless frustration, and a deep ache. Amber's death had torn me apart, into small pieces, not just my heart, but all of me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't frustrated. I was totally lost, utterly confused, and in so much pain that if someone had cut my limbs off without anesthesia right then, I wouldn't have felt any greater pain. I wished I was back to hiding inside myself where nothing got through to me, but I couldn't find that place no matter how hard I tried. I was stuck being fully aware. "Joe?" I heard a woman's voice say. She sounded familiar, but my mind couldn't move away from the anguish long enough to place the voice. "Joe, it's me, Sheila. Are you okay?" Sheila? I should know that name, but it eluded my memory. "Come on, honey. Let me take you home," the voice said softly. I felt someone grab me, trying to lift me. "Please, Joe, you need to stand. I can't lift you by myself." My brain sent a signal to my legs and arms, and I felt like a nearly mindless automaton, just enough brain power to move around and do simple tasks. As I stood, everything came back in a rush. Who Sheila was, what she had done, and what happened to Amber. "Get the hell away from me. I don't need your help," I yelled savagely at Sheila. I felt Sheila let go and step back. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her face was puffy and looked streaked either by tears or raindrops. I didn't care one way or another. "It's okay, Joe. I'm here. I'll take you home. I'll take care of you," Sheila offered in a placating tone. I shook my head and said, "No, Sheila, you won't. I'm going to my hotel, take a shower and go to bed." "But I'm your wife. I'm supposed to take care of my husband. Please, let me," pleaded Sheila. "No, Sheila, we are not husband and wife. Despite some file inside the registrar's office having us listed as married, we haven't been husband and wife since you decided to screw someone else." "I'm sorry about that, Joe. I truly am. I don't know what to say or do to prove to you how sorry I am. I even went to my family and friends and told them how wrong I was about you and what I did to you. I spared no blame. Please, Joe, give me another chance. I'll be the best wife you could ever have. I'll do anything to make it right with you," she begged tearfully. I was tired of talking, so I shook my head at her. I wanted to be left alone. I didn't need this shit from Sheila. We were history, and I loved history. I began to shuffle away from her as she cried out, "Please, please, Joe, forgive me. Give me another chance. I promise I'll." She went on pleading, but I shut her out and kept walking away. Sheila grabbed my arm to stop me, but I shook her off violently, turning to her and yelling out all my pain and torment to her. "Leave me alone. Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me. And don't follow me. I've had it with you. We are done. Done. You hear me, Sheila? Now, leave me alone." I walked to a corner, crossed the street, without bothering to check for traffic. I didn't care if I was run over. I didn't know whether I was going in the right direction to get to my hotel. The hotel where Amber worked. Tears filled my eyes and I could feel a great emotion well up in me. I kept walking. I didn't want Sheila to see me like this. I wanted no part of that woman, especially as I grieved. I made it to another corner. A cab approached and I waved it down. I was soaking wet and the cab driver made some comment about that in his back seat. I told him to shut up. I'd double his fare to include any damage from my wet clothing. When we arrived at the hotel, like a brooding volcano, my emotions built up pressure as I held them in check during the cab ride. After paying off the cab driver, I was barely able to make it to my room before the volcano erupted, and I wept like I hadn't since I was a teen, on the day my parents had died. I stayed drunk for days, although I don't recall much of that time. My only clue as to how heavily I drank was by the number of empty bourbon and beer bottles scattered about the hotel suite. There was a distinct fetid odor mixed with the strong smell of stale vomit that permeated the 2 rooms that compromised my suite. And it was that rank aroma that woke me from my alcohol-induced stupor, that and the need to heave out the remaining consumption of the last few days. As I staggered to the bathroom, which was in worse shape than the rest of the place, the memory of what had brought me to my present state descended on me like a tsunami. A yawning ache expanded deep within me, even as what filled my stomach hurtled out in a spray of slimy brown liquid. I retched as only the truly miserable can, with a detached mind, barely aware of what the body did, while filled with disturbing emotional impressions and discordant thought. How could my heart pump blood, working unceasingly, yet be broke? How could the body endure so much pain and still want to live? But the most disturbing thought was, how could this most painful of loves blossom in such a short time for a woman that for the longest time was my nemesis? I didn't know. Perhaps that particular lack of knowing bothered me the most. Her dying words echoed without end in my head, and instead of bringing me joy, they only magnified the unceasing pain. As I dry heaved, an innocuous question slowly wormed unbidden into my misery. How long had I been in this boozed-up haze? My trusty BlackBerry answered that question. 3 days. 3 days in which I had stopped the world. A world that didn't care about births and deaths. A world that would never know what might have been, and didn't care about that either. But it slowly dawned on me that I cared. I knew she was dead, but what I didn't know was what arrangements had been made for Amber's funeral. The thought brought a renewed pummeling to my already sore being, but I needed to be with her. I needed to see her one last time, even in death. What tears I had already shed were the last that would course down my face, despite that the degree of heartache I felt remained undiminished. Gathering my wits, I called room service and requested a large pot of coffee, a larger bottle of aspirin, the newspaper editions for the last 3 days, and housekeeping. I would pay out of pocket for the extra costs incurred for cleaning my mess. Plus, I would leave a large tip to the poor housekeeper. After showering and dressing, I attacked the coffee, swallowed some aspirin, and grabbed the newspapers. I didn't feel much better. Between the hammer and anvil effect of the hangover and the constant leaden ache in my chest, I felt like I was ready to join Amber in death. A housekeeper finally arrived, saw the mess, left, but quickly returned with reinforcements. The occasional looks of thinly veiled disgust they threw my way as they cleaned had me rethinking the size of their tip. Upward. Definitely upward. There was a brief paragraph describing the accident, but there was no information in the obituaries section as to Amber's funeral. I cudgeled my still pickled brain, trying to remember if Amber's parents, the Mortons, had moved out of state or not. If they had, then her funeral would probably be held wherever her parents now lived. Sheila would know, but I'd be damned to hell before I would contact her. The only other people who might know the disposition of Amber's body would be the police. With more than a little trepidation, I dialed. New York City Police Department. Officer Brown, what's the nature of your call? Hello, I'm Joe Pleasant. I'm trying to get information about an accident victim, Amber Morton. I was wondering where her body was sent. I'd like to attend her funeral, but the newspaper has no information, and I don't know how to contact her next of kin. After asking a few questions, the desk cop transferred me. Central Investigations. Lieutenant Richards speaking. How can I help you? After explaining my problem again, a hollow silence ensued. Mr. Pleasant, is it? Asked the lieutenant finally. Yes, Joe Pleasant. Mr. Pleasant, I was one of the investigators at the scene. Considering your emotional state at the time, you might not remember me, but we spoke. Do you remember? I thought for a moment, but nothing came to mind. I'm sorry, Lieutenant Richards, but I really don't. I don't remember much of anything after the incident. I see. His tone suggested I was lying. Maybe that's a common police approach, suspect everyone. Well, I questioned you as to what happened. You weren't very coherent, but what little I managed to understand matched other eyewitness accounts. The EMTs worked on her, miss? I heard the soft crinkle of papers being shuffled. Miss Amber Morton, as you and I spoke? Okay, I replied with a hint of impatience. So, I ask you, Mr. Pleasant, why are you calling me? Questioned the lieutenant with more than a hint of irritation. What? I don't understand. As I've already explained, I thought you might know where A&B, Miss Morton's funeral, is to be held. I stated flatly, as I felt my anger rising at his deliberately obtuse manner. I see. Once again I heard the overtones questioning my honesty. Come by the precinct and we'll continue this conversation. Maybe then we'll both get the answers we each want, said the lieutenant in a deceptively languid manner. Why, Lieutenant Richards? Am I under suspicion? Do I need an attorney present? I demanded, ignoring his sudden change in demeanor. I don't know if you need an attorney, Mr. Pleasant. Have you done anything that makes you think you need an attorney? Asked the lieutenant in a tone indicating a strong interest in my answer. No, Lieutenant, unless you consider killing several bottles of booze a crime. I replied flippantly. It depends. If you were driving at the time, and if you puked up the good stuff. His joke had me smiling, despite how shitty I felt, and made me realize there was no sense in arguing with a guy that knows his booze. Okay, Lieutenant Richards, I'll be there in about an hour. Wow, you look like shit, was the greeting Richards gave me as I sat down in his cubicle. Thanks. I feel worse. I'm sure you do, Mr. Pleasant. Do you want coffee before we get started? Richards asked me with a slight smirk. Any more coffee and I'd decorate his desk, his shirt, and probably his shoes like an electric peculator minus the top. He probably knew that too. No thanks. Let's just get started. He gave me a critical look for a moment before nodding and grabbing a folder off his desk. Mr. Pleasant, the reason I asked you to come in is because your question caused me some curiosity. Curiosity? What the hell? He had me come in because he was curious? Oh, my head. I guess he saw the look of incredulity tinged by anger on my pained face, because he quickly put up his hand to calm me. Not exactly like that, Mr. Pleasant. It's a little more serious than a police lieutenant wanting to satisfy personal curiosity. I assure you this is official police business. He opened the folder and began flipping through the papers in it. What did the vehicle look like that hit Miss Morton? Do you recall make and model? He asked casually as he continued to go through the folder. His question caught me by surprise, but it also caused an involuntary flashback to that night. I had thought about the accident, of course I had, but not in any detail. It was more that my view of the entire scene was meshed with emotionally charged points. But because of the question, I see Amber, her back to me, walking away quickly, almost running. I hear the diminishing sound of the rapid click-clack of her high heels against the concrete sidewalk. I see her step out into the street, oblivious to anything as she holds her lowered face cupped in her hands. I see the headlights of the approaching car reflected off the wet sheen of the street and the walls of the buildings before I actually saw the car, and the beams of the headlights seem to swing out before they center in the street. I see Amber has almost reached the other side of the street when a dark color car makes an appearance within my line of sight. I hear the muted but distinct roar of an engine as the car accelerates. I see the car drift toward the other side of the street, away from me. I see the car hit Amber and... Oh my God. What? What is it, Mr. Pleasant? I looked at the lieutenant as he spoke, his gaze as serious as his voice, but he was also giving me a hard, appraising look. I felt even queasier as I realized my suspicions, but I swallowed the bile and looked back at the lieutenant. No, I know the car was aiming for Amber. It was no accident. It was murder. I state to the lieutenant with the same certitude as I would in claiming the sun will rise tomorrow. A brief look of surprise crossed his face before settling into a neutral expression. I see, he says, his tone once again questioning the veracity of my statement. Man, I had begun to hate that phrase. What does he see anyway? How can you be so sure? Before I could reply, he continued. Look, why not tell me what you remember and we'll go from there? Okay. Nodding in agreement, I explained what came to memory. He wrote in his folder as I spoke, and every now and then he would interrupt to ask pointed questions, some not having to do with the incident, such as what Amber and I were doing before the incident and where I was the days after the incident. I didn't get into certain details that didn't directly involve Amber getting hit by the car. I guess Richard sensed I was holding something back because after I had finished with my story he asked, "What sort of relationship did you and Amber have, Mr. Pleasant? And aren't you married to a Sheila Pleasant, formerly Sheila Rogers?" The questions belied the implication that I wasn't having an affair. Was I that transparent, or was he that good a cop? Or maybe he was just covering all his bases. We didn't have a relationship. Amber and I were just friendly, no more than that. And yes, for the moment I'm married to Sheila. If you know whom I'm married to, then I suspect you know we are separated and in the process of a divorce. There was no sense in holding back what was easily available through the public record. Plus, I had the distinct impression that with Richards, a secret held was a suspicion made. With a slight smile, he says, "I think that's it, Mr. Pleasant. If we need anything else, we'll call you. Thanks for stopping by, and I hope you feel better soon, or at least look better." Chuckling at his own joke, he stood, ready to usher me out. "Wait, that's it?" I asked incredulously. "What else is there, Mr. Pleasant? We are investigating the incident as a hit and run, and with the help of the street cams, I'm sure we'll identify the vehicle. It's just a matter of time," he explained patiently as if to a not-so-bright child, as he gave me an inquisitive look. "I mean, the car hit Amber on purpose, before leaving the scene. That's certainly a hit and run, but it's also murder," I exclaimed loudly. He gave me another one of those patient smiles, saying mildly, "No, Mr. Pleasant, it isn't murder." "What? Of course it is. It was no accident. I saw." I began angrily, but he cut me off. "It's not murder, Mr. Pleasant, because Miss Norton is not dead." "What? Not dead? Who is not dead?" I asked myself idly. Richards must have seen the shock and astonishment on my face, because he sat back down in his chair and leaned forward. In a low-pitched but surprisingly kind voice, he said, "Amber Morton is not dead, Joe. May I call you Joe? The doctors expect her to live. She's pretty bad off, but she'll survive." As his words reached my ears, my mind went blank and my chest constricted with fresh emotions. It was the resurrection of a dead hope and the revival of a joy I'd not known in years. Looking up at Richards and meeting his eyes with my own desperate ones must have affected him, because he smiled. I don't know what look I had on my face that caused him to smile, but at that moment in time he looked almost human. Then my mind caught up, and I had to hear his words again. "Amber, she's alive?" I whispered disbelievingly, more to myself than the lieutenant, but he must have heard me. "Yes, Joe, she's alive." I sat there for a time that is immeasurable by any time-keeping device, with his words echoing over and over in my head, before I was able to respond to them. "How? I saw her die. I mean, shit. I don't know what I mean. Where is she? What hospital? Can I see her? Is she going to be okay?" I fired off as quickly as my tongue could form the words. Detective Richards's smile grew a bit more, and his eyes shone with a mirth that jumped the distance across us, and I began to laugh. I laughed until I cried. After I had calmed down, he stated, "I know you expected worse news, but I'm glad that I can't oblige you. I don't know if you can see her. That would be up to the hospital and her family. From what I've been told, the doctors are sure she will recover. There are injuries that will have her immobilized for weeks or longer, but the doctors expect her to make a full recovery." Looking thoughtful, the lieutenant pulled something from the folder, looked at it as he wrote something on a notepad, then tore the page loose and handed it to me. "This is the name of the hospital, the address, and room number of Miss Morton." Richard stood up again and offered me his hand. I stood up too, knowing my visit with him was at an end. I shook his hand, but as I got ready to leave, a nagging question came to mind. "Were you going to tell me any of this earlier, before I left?" Taking a deep breath, he stared directly into my eyes, replying, "I hadn't planned on it, Mr. Pleasant. But when I saw how upset you were thinking she'd been murdered, I changed my mind. Call it a gut instinct." I didn't know what to say to his brutal honesty, other than, "Well, thanks for your honesty, Detective Richards. I'm sorry, Mr. Pleasant, but the truth is we don't normally divulge that sort of information to the public. I'm sure you would have discovered she was alive on your own, eventually. I hope you understand." I didn't like it, but yeah, I understood. I shrugged my shoulders in way of an answer. I guess he understood too, because he waved me off, telling me to get out of his office. I mentioned that I hated hospitals. I'd been in two, on the day I was born, and the day Amber was injured in France. Fortunately, I'd never needed to be in one for my own medical needs. So with as much calm indifference as I could muster, I arrived at the hospital Amber had been admitted to. I found the floor where Amber was at, but the nurse refused to let me see Amber unless I was related. As luck would have it, when I reached the elevators on my way out, one of the elevators opened and Amber's parents stepped out. I didn't know them all that well, although we had met on occasion. They seemed like pretty decent people, which in the past had me wondering how they could have raised such a belligerent and hateful person as Amber. Of course, that was then and this is now. All I can say is that things change. I can't say they were happy to see me, but they were cordial enough. They knew of my dislike of Amber and how she felt about me, so it wasn't easy facing them. At my request to see Amber, they hesitated. I don't know about that, Joseph, said Paul Morton. She needs her rest and she doesn't need to be agitated, even if she is in a coma, added Julia Morton. In a coma? I assure you both, my intent is only to see her and ensure my own senses of her well-being. I explained with as much sincerity I could muster into my voice. I promise not to utter a peep, and you'll both be there, watching me. Mrs. Morton looked at her husband with a questioning gaze, obviously uncertain as to my intentions, whether I was just saying what they wanted to hear, or if I was truly being upfront. Mr. Moron looked from his wife to me and sighed. Son, I hope you aren't playing some game with us. He threw up a hand to forestall any denial from me. If we let you in to see our daughter, you will not only do as you've already stated, but you won't enter into her room any further than 2 steps past the door. And you won't stay but a minute. Do you understand? Yes, sir. I understand. And thank you. Not so fast, Joseph. I still have to discuss this with my wife, and she has to agree. With that, he and Mrs. Morton stepped away from me. They moved far enough that I couldn't make out what they said. Not that I wanted to, but I caught a few words here and there. I was excited and frightened at the prospect of seeing Amber. Excited because of what my heart felt towards her. The thought of seeing her alive, after believing she'd been killed, was building up to a sense of euphoria. Yet, that same thought was bringing about a disproportionate feeling of fear for her physical appearance and future well-being. That she was in a coma, a shock to me to be sure, but also a sort of blessing for Amber. Hopefully the worst of her physical injuries would be healed before she had to face whatever issues remained. She wouldn't face them alone. No doubt her parents would be there for her. But so would I, even if it meant having to deal with Sheila. As my mind went from thought to thought, I absent-mindedly noticed Amber's parents throwing furtive glances my way as they whispered to each other. I had a good idea of what they were saying, but I suspected they also weren't aware of Amber's and mine changed relationship. Finally, they turned away from each other, and like a pair of morose hangmen, they approached me. Okay, you can come in with us, Joseph, but remember what I said, intoned the first hangman in a voice made harsh by obviously stifled emotion. Any deviation from our agreement, and I'll call security, and you will never be welcome again. Yes, sir, I. Before I could complete my reply, the second hangman spoke up. Joseph, before we let you in, I want to know why you need to see Amber. As I understand it, you and Amber have had personal problems since you've known her, and now, all of a sudden you care about my daughter's welfare? Since when? What is going on, Joseph? And where is Sheila? We haven't seen her any of the times we've been here, asked the female hangman in no less a harsh tone as her male counterpart. I hadn't expected those questions. I wasn't certain of the answers myself, and all sorts of thoughts invaded my mind, trying to come up with an answer. Like a small army, they tromped all over, making their presence felt by their mass movements, but none of those individual thoughts made their way to the forefront. What could I say in a way of explanation? The truth? Honestly, Mrs. Morton, I don't know why I want to see Amber. What I can tell you is that Amber and I have changed the respective views we had of each other. Since she came to France and stayed with me, while she recuperated, we got to know each other better. And that? You and her? Amber stayed with you in France? Recuperating? Was Sheila with you? Asked Amber's mother as a dazed look spread across her face. I glanced at Mr. Morton. His expression reminded me of a lion readying to pounce on a wounded antelope. Yes, ma'am, she did, but she was hurt and... She was hurt? Who? Amber? How? Did you? Began Mrs. Morton, before I cut her off. Yes, ma'am. Amber. No, ma'am. I never laid a hand on her. She tripped on a rug and fell into a glass table. She was hospitalized and I offered. Once again, I was interrupted, but this time by Papa Lion. I think we had better sit down, Mr. Pleasant, while you fill us in on everything. From the beginning, growled the lion. I cast a regretful glance in the direction of Amber's room, then sighing, I sat, joining her parents in what I was certain was to be an interrogation that would easily compete with the CIA's best, and which would certainly have them calling security to escort me out the hospital and out of Amber's life. After what seemed like hours, but in actuality was only 45 minutes, both of Amber's parents sat back and looked at me with mixed expressions of relief, anger, and curiosity. I didn't get into the details of the last time I'd seen Amber. For one, how could I explain that I was partially to blame for Amber running off blindly? And two, no matter if I was at fault or not, her parents would undoubtedly blame me, thus my chance of seeing Amber would be nil. Finally, the lion spoke up. Joseph, do you love my daughter? Is that what you've been trying to say for the last few minutes? I opened my mouth to deny any such thing. But since I was being so honest, so forthright about things, why not just continue in the same manner? I want to say no, but I can't. I just don't know. Maybe I do. I paused to collect my thoughts and my courage. My damn deodorant had quit, and I could smell the fear in my sweat. What I do know is that since France, when I've seen her, I felt better inside. She brings a smile to my face. That night of the accident, afterwards, I had never felt such pain and known such desolation as when I thought she had died. It's why I came today, to see her for myself, to make sure she is alive. That's all well and good, Joseph, but you're a married man. And does she feel the same about you? Asked Amber's father, less the lion now. To address your first statement, yes, I'm married, but my petition for divorce was filed over a year ago. Nearly 2 years. Sheila and her attorney have managed to slow down the divorce proceedings through legal roadblocks. Sheila and I have been separated for about the same time. If there was to be any reconciliation, it would have occurred by now. But I don't want to be married to Sheila. There's been too much water under the bridge for that boat to float now. As for Amber, I can only hope. Is your divorce the consequence of what happened between you and Amber? Asked the now-returned lion. No, sir. Certainly not. The divorce is solely due to the actions of my wife. I hadn't gotten into the details of why I was divorcing Sheila, but I'd had enough of 20 questions and I was tired of it. Plus, I was feeling physically nearly the same as I had earlier in the morning. My head was pounding remorselessly. Hopefully they wouldn't be offended at my refusal to answer any more questions, as I really wanted to see Amber. Nevertheless, I was putting a stop to it. Not to be rude, Mr. and Mrs. Morton, but I think I've explained things well beyond the bounds of propriety and answered enough of your questions. Now, if you don't mind, I would like to see Amber. I had this terrible feeling as the moment hung in the air, waiting to be told to leave and not return. They looked at each other a moment, before turning to face me again. Okay, son, let's go. Same limit stand as before, but you're welcome to join us, said Mr. Morton, his voice firm but slightly more friendly. Just slightly. I felt indescribable relief at his reply. However, the roller coaster ride they'd put me on had left me feeling disoriented as to where my relationship stood with them. First, I was son, then Joseph, then Mr. Pleasant, now son again? I think, if I ever have a daughter, the first time she has a boyfriend, I'll always call him dumb shit, just to keep him from getting confused as to where he stands with me. Amber's still form seemed surrounded by a soft glow, almost ethereal. It could have been the low lighting causing the effect, yet I believed it was a spiritual glow. At least that was my first impression. My view of her was separated by about 15 feet, which by any measure is not much of a distance, but the feeling that filled me by not being able to reach out and touch her hands, her face, her body, made those few feet an unbridgeable abyss. Her face seemed unmarred and a look of peace graced it, reminding me of a previous time and another place where I'd seen her much the same. Only this time her angelic countenance was not false, but very real. My eyes followed along the length of her prone body. The thin linen sheet that covered Amber sheathed her so well that I could easily see every rolling contour. There was something odd at her feet, or where her feet should be. There was only foot under the blanket. Her right foot. I looked back up her body and saw where the sheet dropped off, just past where her left knee would be at. I must have made some sound, because Amber's father abruptly turned towards me. I don't know what expression I wore, but I suspect the horror of what I felt must have seeped into my face. He nodded slightly, as if verifying what I'd seen, then acknowledging my emotion to it. More than ever I wanted to approach Amber's still form and hold her. Paul Morton somehow knew of my desire and, taking pity, waved me closer. I stepped up slowly, quietly, carefully. I moved to stand next to the head of the bed, near Amber's head. As I did, I almost wished I hadn't. The light was no longer the soft luminance it appeared from a few feet away. It was now a harsh, unveiling spotlight, revealing dark bruises, red scrapes, and stitched slashes covering her face. Her eyelids were dark and puffy. Her nose was bluish-tinged and enlarged with small breathing tubes inserted into her caked nostrils. Her lips were swollen and appeared raw. She had a large, flexible, corrugated tube that ran out of her mouth and was affixed to the side of her face with tape. Her neck was immobilized by a large plastic collar that sat on her shoulders and supported her chin. One of her arms was encased from shoulder to hand in a thick-looking cast. I also noticed Amber had no gown on, only the thin sheet covered her. Not embarrassing to Amber, but certainly to her parents. If her father's reddening face and her mother's pink-tinted cheeks were any indication, I was embarrassed too, but it had more to do with her parents being there than with my own reaction to Amber's autonomous reaction. I don't know how long I stayed with Amber, but it was longer than I should have been allowed to, and longer than her parents had stayed. They left the room sometime while I remained lost in my thoughts that once more, I had no recollection of. A nurse entering the room, gently chiding me for being there, broke me from my reverie. I left the room, pausing to take another glance at Amber's still form. The nurse had switched on more lighting, and the spiritual magic I'd first felt upon entering the room had disappeared, leaving only the soft beeping of modern medical technology that used its own magic to monitor and maintain a single life. I saw Amber's parents sitting, huddled together on a small couch. I went up to them and thanked them for allowing me to see Amber. I offered what condolences I could, as well as telling them that whatever they needed, or if Amber required anything, to call me and it would be done. I don't think they believed me. I left them my business card anyway, writing my personal cell phone number on the back. I told them I would return the following day. They nodded, but I think they were too lost in their own grief to pay my words much attention. That evening, something nagged at me, causing me a restless sleep. I couldn't place the problem, but I felt it had something to do with the hit and run. It was just below the surface of my consciousness, however, it refused to reveal itself. I slept without remembering any dream. Yet, I awoke as if I had had a nightmare. I was in a numb haze at work, my responses being automatic rather than coming from a higher cerebral order. Seeing Amber and knowing she was alive was a buffering experience, despite the fact that she was in a coma and had lost a leg. Still, the fact that she was in a coma and that she was no longer whole was a definite damper. Involuntarily, my mind kept going back to the incident even as I recalled Amber before the hit and run and after. I'm not sure why I was comparing the before and afters. Perhaps it was an unwitting psychological method with which to come to grips with the present reality. This went on for several days. I went to work, pretending things were fine, and each evening I went to the hospital to sit with Amber. I took to reading short stories to her, at first when I was alone with her. Then when her parents caught me, with their grudging approval, I read to her constantly. In the evenings, as I lay waiting for sleep to descend, that disquieting sensation would settle in, its demand for attention becoming increasingly more insistent. 2 weeks had passed since I'd first discovered Amber was alive, and then one day everything came into sharp focus thanks to a phone call from an unexpected source. I'd just returned from lunch and was preparing for our weekly numbers crunching session with the regional sales directors when my assistant informed me I had a call. Without thinking, I picked up the handset and answered the call. Nominally, my assistant, Ian Taylor in this case, would inform me of the caller's identity, but he was new and we were extremely busy, even harried, so he can be forgiven for his lapse. As my own lapse for not inquiring as to the caller's name, which I probably won't forgive myself for. It was Sheila. "Joe, I really need to talk to you. Can we?" Although Sheila's call was unexpected, I'd prepared for its eventuality. In the ensuing months since watching her sex video, I'd gone over in my head every possible conversation and the rationale behind each one, what she would say, and how I would respond. Naturally, I couldn't predict the exact wording that would be used, or the tonal inflections used to birth each word, but I'd forced myself to face the emotional conflict that would arise from such a conversation, so although surprised, I was as ready as I could have been. So, I interrupted her before she could get rolling. "No, we cannot and will not meet to talk over any chance at reconciliation. It's over. There is no possibility in any lifetime that I'm part of that you and I will get back together. Our marriage is over. It was over the very second you screwed someone else. There is nothing you can say that will reverse what's happened, nor will playful cuddling and loving sex do anything but brand you as a pitiful bitch in my book. Please, Joe, don't call me that. I've told you. I'm sorry for the mistake I made. If you just give me a chance, I'm sure we can." "You are not listening, Sheila. No, yet, never. Don't call me again. Just sign the divorce papers. I'm sure once you realize that what's left of the marriage is just a burden, you'll feel much better about it." I know I would definitely be feeling better once I'd rid myself of the troublesome burden that was Sheila, but I didn't tell her that. "But I saw how you were that night. I saw you needed me. And..." My mind clicked, and what had been laying below the layer of full consciousness suddenly bobbed to the surface, much like a balloon inflated underwater. Although I could hear Sheila's incessant droning, my mind was now on something else. I began to wonder why Sheila had been there that night. How could she have known about the hit and run and arrived so quickly? How could I have forgotten Sheila being there that night? I tried to think, but Sheila's annoying pleading kept breaking my train of thought. Without a word, I set the phone down into its cradle. Hanging up on Sheila, I pulled out a fresh notepad and began to sort out the timeline for the evening in question. It was about 10 p.m. when Amber and I left the restaurant. I arrived at the hotel shortly after 12 a.m. I'd have to check the police report for some of this, but assuming a 15-minute interval for the time we began kissing, Amber getting hit, and help arriving. Then I caught a cab about 10 minutes after Sheila tried to take me to her home. Add another 15 minutes for the cab ride. That would put Sheila finding me at about 11:30 p.m., which meant, unless Sheila was constantly listening to a police band radio, there was no way she could have found out about the hit and run in the roughly 1-hour interval between the police and medical arriving and the time she found me. Unless Sheila was already there. Dear listeners, the consecutive part will be published soon. Please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.